Hi, I hope you can hear me over the fan. This is a brainstorming video about Genesis 7 and 8's benchmarks of days as a paradigmal calendar of time, because that's what I suspect is the point of God making these benchmarks. All right? So I'm going to go through them. The document that you see on screen you can download. It'll be in the video description. It's still in draft, but that's going to be the talking point. So I'm just going to go through it here and say what I think are the meanings, and then maybe you can come up with other ideas, whether they conflict with what I say or not, I don't care, so that we can sort of like talk this thing out. I'm not going to be able to make more videos on this time question probably until Christmas or maybe next year. I've got a heck of a lot on my plate right now. So this is going to be the last video for a while. Let's put it that way. So let's start in here. You know, you can pull out your Bible and see what the verses are. I'm just going to go through the numbers of them. In that verse, that's the famous Genesis 7:11, which Harold Camping misused. The actual text in Hebrew, I submit to you, is a mistake. They've left out, they put the word esher in there, and it should be eshrim. All right? And if it does, if that's the proper thing, then it will agree with the LXX, which, after all, is a translation of the Hebrew by the Jews. And so they might have had better Hebrew text in those days. All right? And that's what I'm going with here, because the whole timeline fits if you do this. Okay. I'm not going to explain everything you're looking at. I'm just going to focus on the numbers. Number 57. That's real important in Psalm 90's meter, Isaiah 53's meter, Daniel 9's meter, and Paul's meter. It's also very important in the Mosaic Law. Okay, and I'm going to briefly explain what I know about this number. 57, of course, is the number of days short of the time when Noah enters the ark. And that's what I think is the precedence for the 57 days in the Mosaic Law. Now, 57 represents a number of things, so I'm just going to quickly go through it. It represents the number of days between and including the first day of Passover and Pentecost. The Jews today call that counting the Omer, and they count it wrong. Numbers 28:26 tells you that you begin the count of the Omer piggybacked on the last day of Passover, unless the last day of Passover concludes at sundown on a Friday, in which case it's another regular Sabbath, not just the Passover Sabbath. So the 57 kind of has application there. So does 56, which would be the number of days between, if you're only counting either Passover day itself or only Pentecost day itself. Those are very prominent numbers in the meter. And of course they're prominent in the Mosaic Law because they represent in two different ways. The first, as I just mentioned, the count of Passover week plus the 50 days for counting the Omer to Pentecost. All right. The second way that they're illustrated in the law is the sum of tribulation and jubilee, which is 50 years. So, you know, the question that we all should be asking, but it doesn't look like we have been, is why was that in the Mosaic Law to start with? And I mean, you can look in Jewish sources to find out how they consider it. All right. They consider it to be based on the flood. And, you know, whether they're right or not, or their account is garbled, is kind of beside the point. What is the point is that there is a precedence, and we can see it right here in the Bible text. Noah, 57, you know, on his birthday, that's 57 days short. We know that because when he goes into the ark on the first day of the flood, it's the 27th day of the second month after his birthday. God is using Noah's birthday as the year. And especially if you look at the LXX text, you can tell that. Because it doesn't use the double definite article that it uses for official calendar. It's using a single definite article, okay, to denote that it's Moses' year. Noah's year. In other words, the 27th day after his birthday. And again, this is the LXX text. All right? So this we have to begin back here. Now, think about that, what that means. The same thing that it means in the Mosaic Law. Jubilee and Pentecost both represent harvesting the Gentiles. Well, what's Noah? A Gentile. What's happening to Noah in the flood? He's being harvested. He's being cut apart from. He's being saved. You know, harvesting means all those things. You're saving the good crops and you're getting rid of the bad crops. You're cutting the good crops from the bad crops. Okay? It's the same idea. 50 represents a harvesting, just like it does in the Mosaic Law. Between first fruits, which is piggybacked on the last day of Passover, and Pentecost, which is 50 days later. Okay? So that precedence is right here with Noah, and the 50 is first. And so too you have Jubilee and the tribulation. In that case, it's reversed, and that's exactly what we see here. In other words, Jubilee was the 50 years of harvesting the Gentiles, after which will come the 7 years of tribulation, and that's been forecast ever since Psalm 90. Okay, I suspect now, I have to prove it out yet, I suspect that's based on Jacob's years. The fact that he had to serve an extra 7 years for Rachel, you know, he served the 7 years first. That was his tribulation. Then instead of getting Rachel, he got Leah. So he had to serve another 7 years, even though he got both women at the same time. He had to finish out the second 7 years for Rachel. Okay, and then he ends up staying a third 7 years, which I'll get to later on in this timeline. So I think Jacob's life is being illustrated here, which happens, of course, after the flood. But the 57 represents a combination of harvesting and tribulation. So what do you got? It's the same meaning as the tribulation in the Mosaic Law, except it's happening to Noah. 7 years, days, prior to getting into the boat. God says, get ready, get packing, put everybody in the boat. Okay? And the tribulation itself is a warning that has a beginning, and when it begins, you're told how to know. And you get 7 years after that. That's your first warning and your ending warning. Same pattern. And it's playing like Jubilee and Tribulation in reverse. Whereas in the calendar, it's playing first the 7 and then the 50. Why? Because Messiah is paying on Passover, and the harvesting comes after he pays. You can't harvest what hasn't been, seeded, right? So that accounts for why it's like this in the Noahic period. And obviously there's a parallel being drawn in the Mosaic Law, in the way Christ dies, in the way the calendar is done in the Mosaic Law. Okay? So here we got day 1, the flood, and you can find it elsewhere, like in Peter. 1 Peter 3:18 and 19 just came to mind. How Noah illustrates salvation. The human race is basically in Noah when he gets in the boat. Alright? The human race is in Christ on the cross. The whole human race, not just the elect. Okay? Whole human race, parallel in both cases. Christ is on the cross, he's being baptized with our sins. Noah is in the ark, which represents Christ, and the water's all around him. We are in Christ on the cross. That's the theme of Romans, Romans 8, Romans 5, and Romans 8. And Romans 6, especially Romans 6. Okay? And also Romans 9, 10, and 11. Keep elaborating on that. Alright? So then this is the entry into the ark. This is the entry, Christ on the cross, and this is Pentecost, right here. See, because what I'm basically coming up with is that in order for this timeline to be as apt as it is, I'm basically coming up with an assumption, but it looks like it's pretty accurate, that Noah was born on what would become Passover. Okay? See, ties to Passover's day. That's an assumption. Now, historically, the Jews have assumed that Noah was born on the vernal equinox. And there's going to be a link to a book on Amazon, which goes through all of the Targums and everything showing that kind of interpretation. He just collected the Targums and the MSS on Genesis 7 and 8, and he lists, that kind of interpretation, how people interpreted the importance of the flood. Okay, but right here, and I think it's a good assumption, I'm assuming that Noah was born on what would become Passover. It's just too apt. So this ends up being what would become, and the Jews don't call it this day today, but they should, 11 and 12 of Sivan, okay, as Pentecost. They call it by different names because they're using a lunar calendar. Their lunar calendar is wrong. Every month in the Bible had 30 days except for Adar. And there's a possibility that some of them had 31. I'm still looking into that. But if it's true that it's 30, because that's using the 1 Chronicles 24 priestly course names and their meanings, that would be 30 days each, and then Adar just ended up getting the overage. Okay, and if you got arguments against that, let me know. But the Jewish calendar today is lunar, and it's just flat wrong. That's it, and that's understandable why it's wrong, but it's wrong. Okay, a lot of things in life are wrong. You fix it and move on. So this would be Pentecost. One way or the other, this is Pentecost. Okay? Okay, the next entry item is 40 days, and that we all know what 40 means. 40 means testing, so it's not too surprising that it's 40 days flooding coupled with rain. Now, the people who actually know the Bible realize that most of the flooding that occurred came from earthquakes or other kind of breaks in the crust from under the earth, so all the water came up and basically the subduction and everything kind of just sank for a while. And the rain, well, that was just additional. There wasn't the flooding wasn't really caused by the rain. It was just on top of the real flooding, which was caused by the subduction. And if you know anything about geology, you know that there are, as they call them, tectonic plates that are all over the globe. They sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And it'd be real easy if they all shifted at the same time for that water to come shooting up and drown everybody. Okay, because basically all the continents are floating on water. So it's not too hard to understand. And in fact, the geologists are estimating that something they call Pangea was once the Earth's crust was all one unit and it didn't have those fissures in it. So at some point in the past, they assumed that those fissures occurred, and that's why the continents floated as they did. In other words, they weren't initially floating. The whole world was underwater initially. Of course, that ties to Genesis 1 and 2, but we won't talk about that. Let's just go on. 40 days. We all kind of know what that is, time of testing. Okay, now that's obviously represented in Israel's history. It's represented as a sort of catchphrase in the Mosaic Law, time of warning, time of judgment. A lot of the prophets, their ministries lasted 40 years. I mean, that's something that pretty much all Christendom knows and agrees on, what the 40 means. So I don't have to elaborate on that. I don't see it much used so far. I don't see it much used in Hebrew meter, but then, I've only examined like about 10 passages at most. Okay, so now we get to the next number. This is really important. 50. 150. 150 happens to be the number of sevens in a 1050 unit of time. Okay? And at this point, it's analogous. Again, I'm not sure why. I'm just saying what it is, and later I'll understand better. 150 is the number of sevens in a 1050. Now, exactly why God's breaking it up like this in this sequence, I don't know yet. I'm just saying what I do know. Maybe you'll figure it out. Maybe you're supposed to figure it out. And let me know so I can save me time. All right, but 150 is the number of sevens in a 1050 unit. All right? So then we go down here, and we're still at the same 1050. And these are by the way, these are my date estimates. for the week, the meaning of the week. This is really kind of important. These are the date estimates to see if the First Chronicle 24 calendar is saying something about that week, okay, that is precedented in the flood, and it looks like it is. Okay, you'll have to analyze that yourself, but I put the names of the weeks in the calendar that correspond to these dates here, and you can decide if that's what it means. Okay, and then off here to the right, I talk about the other priestly course names for the other weeks, and you can play with that. I'm not going to cover that here. So then we come back here. We just finished talking about 150 being equal to the number of sevens in a 1050 unit. Again, why this sequence and why this significance here, I don't know. It could be something else. I'm just telling you what I do know. Again, I'm using the LXX. It's saying that it's the 27th of the 7th month, not the 17th. Okay? And again, that's a simple mistake to make. It's a plural, eshrim, rather than esher. It'd be really easy to make that mistake in copying. All right, then the next point is 243. Okay, and that's 93 days later. Again, using the LXX, it's the 11th month, not the 10th. Now, the significance of 93 is really pretty heavy in both the Mosaic Law and Israel's history. All right? I'm not as quickly able to say the significance of 150 in Israel's history. But obviously, the fact that there are 157s in a 1050 unit would make it important. I haven't done enough more research on what 150 might mean in the Mosaic Law to explain anything now. 93 I know a little bit more about. 93 is the sum of 60 plus 33, or 30 plus 63. Okay? And there are other numbers. Every one of the kinds of factors that go into 93 are all over Israel's history and all over Bible Hebrew meter. So if you've gotten into my Psalm 90 playlist and you've seen the meter there, you already know about this. Paul even uses combinations like this. And I mean, it's real easy for even most Christians to understand some of it. The fact that Christ died when he was 33, that's a factor in 93. The fact that Christ therefore was king of Israel for 33 years, which tallies to the 33 years that David was king of Israel when he was king over all Israel. That's in 1 Kings 2. So David ruled 33 years over all Israel and 7 extra years over just Hebron and Judah. Okay? So those kinds of ties, and of course the 40 years back here, also happens to be a very common ruling number. Joseph is vizier. He was a vizier for 80 years. So that's 2 40s. The 40s are always paired, and you're going to see that here too in Noah's calendar. The number of years that Saul ruled, which you don't find out until Paul talks about it in Acts 13. It's deleted from 1 Samuel 13. Number of years that David ruled, the number of years that Solomon ruled. It's a very common number for judgment or ruling. Same idea, two sides of a coin. Well, but so are the factors here in 93. For example, 40 out of 93 leaves 53. 53 years is the number of years shy of the end of a 1050 that Abraham became mature. It also happens to be that it's really 53 and a half, so I call it 54. It also happens to be the same number of years as remaining the 70-year voting period when Noah got his covenant. Noah got his covenant 16 years into, maybe 16 and a half years into, the voting period for his epoch. Okay, that was 70 years long. That means that there were 56 years remaining, or 56 and a half. All right, so that's a really pregnant number with respect to Noah and with respect to, how the Jews got started. And that really matters because God reimburses that time at the back end. Okay, this 57 number is a double play. It plays at the beginning of the Noahic period, and as we're going to see, it plays at the end. The same thing with the 40. Okay, The 57 plays at the end right here. Okay? So he's in the boat exactly 1 year. And then, of course, the 40 also plays again right here. This is 40 days from the 93. But it also plays inside the 93. And so does the 53. 40 and 53 is 93. So there's a lot of stuff going on here with this 93. I just haven't figured out all the meaning of it yet. That's why I'm talking to you now. Okay, again, the next increment is 40, and that's the second one we've seen. You know, the first one having been up here. All right. Why God is doing it in this sequential order, I don't know. I'm just pointing out what it is. I haven't done enough work on this yet. Maybe you'll figure it out, and please tell me and save me some time. Okay, so you got a 40-year spread represented by 40 days here. Why? Why is it twice? Okay, and I was trying to figure it out. Okay, well, at 93 more days, the mountaintops are visible. Okay, but what does that mean? At the end of 150 days, the ark rests. Well, okay, what does that mean doctrinally? There is a doctrinal meaning. I just don't know what it is. Everything God does has a doctrinal meaning, even the numbers. He's trying to communicate something, and he uses numbers sometimes to do it, to make it more memorable or relevant. And he also, of course, uses the text. They're used in combination. They play off each other, always to teach you something. It's not Bible codes, for crying out loud. Okay? And it's not done to show you that God can count. We all know that. Okay, so what does it mean to say the recession was enough to make the mountaintops visible? That's what the text of 8:5 is telling us. Why? What does that mean? Well, whatever it means, it's a 93-day thing. Similarly here, 40 days later, okay, Noah sends out the raven. What does that mean? He's sending out somebody to get an answer. It's obviously a test. Obviously 40 means testing anyway. It means testing. It means ruling. Okay, but there's more to that meaning. If Noah's sending out a raven, what does that mean? I don't know. I'm just talking. So that's another 40. Okay, and then, and this gets real pregnant, we got a 7 here, a 7 here, and a 7 here. Those are 3 7s, and they're extremely pregnant in the Mosaic Law. Okay, here's your first 7. He waits a week and sends out a dove. Now, I know what 7 means elsewhere in the Bible. I do not know what sending out a dove signifies. Okay, and the dove comes back the same day, but I made that a separate entry here. I don't know he's sending out what? A dove for what? Obviously it's a testing thing, but why a dove, and what does that mean? I'm sure there's a midrash on it somewhere, but I haven't seen it. Haven't looked it up either. Okay, so here's your second 7. Okay, he sends out the dove again. And we know it's the second time because of the word another in 8:10. Because he doesn't say how many days he waited to send it out. He doesn't tell you that. Economy, Hebrew economy of speech. He sends it out again here, which means this was a week later. All right? So, what does that mean in the immediate context of what Noah's saying? Sorry. And then here's the third time he sends her out again after waiting another week, and this time she doesn't return. What's the significance about the fact that she doesn't return? Well, I think I know the answer to that, but first let me talk about this one. Okay. You will find repeated in Hebrew meter especially, but elsewhere, explicitly, 7s. 7 is the number of promise. 7 is also the number of history. 7 is also the number of the last 7 years of history, which we see by means of Passover week, okay, and the tribulation, which, is a mirror of Passover week, okay, because Christ's tribulation has to be repaid to the world, all right? I mean, you can come up with other reasons to say the same thing, but I'm sure you all know that. Okay, So this 7 and this 7 and this, this 7, this 7, and this 7 each have a particular characteristic that is going to be later reflected, that is precedental and therefore later reflected in the Mosaic Law. So I'm not sure which of these 3 sevens represents what I'm going to tell you I know about it. But here's what I know about it, okay? And you can check this and you probably know it immediately. It took 7 years to build the first temple. It took 7 years to build the second temple. Okay, first temple, 1 Kings 6. Second temple, you can look, pretty much anywhere in Haggai especially, but also Ezra 6:15, for example, talks about, the whole idea. So does Nehemiah 6:15, but that's talking about the wall. So there is this convergence of the fact that the first temple took 7 years to build. The second temple took 7 years to build. And the next convergence is, here's a 7 once, here's a 7 twice, here's a 7 a third time, and that is 21, and that is all over Moses' meter in Psalm 90. It's embedded kind of, like, I don't want to call it, marbled in Isaiah 53. And it's somewhat marbled in Daniel 9. It's very pointed in Paul's Ephesians 1:3-14. So the 21, which represents the total number of years Israel was in the land from the time she returned, building the second temple, but she was only spent 7 years of that time actually building the temple. That 21 is a very prominent feature in the meter of Psalm 90, a very prominent feature in Paul's metering of Ephesians 1:3-14, and a marbled feature of Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9. Okay? That 21, okay, obviously being represented here as 3 sevens, means what here? I'm not sure. Now, one of the other things it means is that there are 21 jubilees in a 1050. That's pretty important. 21 of them. Yeah, there are 21 jubilees in a 1050. And the other thing, and this is really important, maybe is the importance for the flood, there are 21 sevens in a 120-year period. Doesn't quite round that way. It rounds to 119. But the next, the end of the 119, which would be the beginning of the 120, right? Beginning of the flood. That's how many are in, there are 21 sevens in a 120-year period. Now, the 120-year period that this is precedenting, right? 120 years warning, then the flood. That is a recurring trend in history, which I show on my past assault video. You can trace it from Adam forward, the flood being the first instance of it being used. We are in such a flood period right now, which began in March, I'm assuming it's March, of 2010, ending in, let's say, March, vernal equinox, of 2130. Okay, so then it becomes kind of important, since it's relevant to us, to know what these 3 sevens really signify. And I don't know. Other than what I told you, I don't know any more about it. So if you know more, I'd like to hear it. Okay? Now, this ending of the 24 is really important because, assuming that Noah was born on the equivalent of Passover, the last day of the 7 year ties to the 10th of Nisan in Exodus 12. That's the Lamb set-aside date. That's the date Christ was arrested, because Israel was operating on a leap year calendar in the year that he was crucified, so she was 4 days too fast. She hadn't intercalated for the leap year. So because of that, the Passover, they instead of intercalating, they had the last day after Adar be the first day of Nisan. and therefore he's eating the Passover, and then is the Passover 4 days later when the real Passover date would have occurred. You see what I'm getting at? And I got all that from the sarcasm, the paraskue verses that are used in the Bible. There's 6 of them, 4 of which, I think 4, are in John 19. John's being very sarcastic, and even the ISBE Encyclopedia noticed that John was being sarcastic, but they couldn't figure out why. This is why. Because the calendar wasn't intercalated. That's how Christ could eat the Passover, yet be the Passover, yet rise 3.5 days later on the last day of Passover. Because it's the interplay between the scheduled official Jewish calendar Passover versus what really would have been the Passover. It's really interesting. Okay, so that precedence, I'm assuming, is here. See? It's 361 days into Noah's birthday. That's the lamb set-aside date. 4 days later, and the text in Genesis does not tell you it's 4 days later. What it does tell you is that Noah is 601 years old. If he was born on the equivalent of Passover, that's what date that would correspond to. Okay? And of course, ties to Passover exactly. Of course, that's sort of, it ties to Passover because that's my assumption to start with. It's tautological. But I submit that if you can find something better, let me know, but this sure seems to fit what God means. Okay? And again, there's a link in the video description to a book that talks about what the ancients thought about the tie to Noah. And you can maybe buy it. I'm going to be buying it. I haven't done it yet. And then you and I can argue about it or talk about it or whatever. But anyway, this is Noah's birthday, which I'm assuming is Passover. And therefore this ties to the lamb set-aside date. Now, Noah comes out, and even the BHS text says this in 8:14, Genesis 8:14. Noah comes out on the 57th day after he's been 601 years old. Okay, well, if he went in also on the 57th day after his birthday, he would have been in exactly 1 year when he leaves. Exactly. Now, it turns out that the Book of Jubilees and also Philo maintain that Noah was there exactly 1 year, and that the coming out day represents Pentecost, which again it would. Okay, this is what I'm coming up with as the date of Pentecost using, the priestly courses from 1 Chronicles 1 Chronicles 24. Okay, so if it ties to Pentecost here, and he was only in a year, then honey, that's when he went into the boat. Right here. Which is justified by the LXX text, which I maintain would be justified by the Hebrew text if they just said Eshrim rather than Esher. Anyway, that's all I know about it. If you've got other information, I'd love to hear it. And then, of course, these are notes that you can... see this thing here? This is a book I was talking about earlier. So you can access it either by the video description or by this document here. And now my computer's slowing down because when I record, it really goes into a hang. So I think what I'm going to have to do is sign off. But see that link where it says Jack Pearl Lewis? That's the guy who wrote the $129 book you can buy at Amazon.